We go camping with my father every summer. He's been doing this his whole life and I just started doing it too. I am 16 years old and I went on a seasonal trip with my father last year. We found this place online while looking for a new camp to try for the summer. There are no photos of the area, but the map is easy to follow and the route description is comfortable and not crowded. We set out on Friday morning, parked on the side of the road and started walking down the road. Some places are very steep and many of the roads are muddy or overgrown, making the path very difficult. Anyway, we got there, barely got out and finally made it to the campsite. It didn't look much different from the trees we've been walking through for the last 2 hours. There are trees everywhere, just a large grassy area to put our stuff. It's not cold or anything. We set up the tent and prepared lunch. Since my father was a man of few words, we spent the rest of our time just talking. However, while we were talking, a noise behind us interrupted our conversation. We all stopped talking and turned around. The trees suddenly went silent and we couldn't see anyone. It wasn't coming from that far away, about a mile away. None of us spoke for 30 seconds. We just looked at the tree, trying to catch any movement. Then another voice was heard, a man's voice, shouting. Completely chilled me out. The screams were loud and harsh, as if they were in trouble. He turned me around and took me back to camp and quickly lit the fire. But the screams kept coming, and eventually I asked my father if we could help them. I can say that my father considered every option. He met me and told me to stay by the fire and wait. He looked big and said he would run away from the sound to see what he could see, and if I saw anyone he wouldn't let them near me. I agreed and watched the man run to the sound of his voice. I don't know what I would do if I were my father. I feel bad for leaving behind someone who needed help, but at the same time we're in the middle of the woods, so something happened. So, I don't know. After 10 minutes I started to get a little worried. The sun seems to be setting, but still no sign of my father. But suddenly the screams stopped. Now the entire forest was silent again. I wonder if my father saw him and helped him or if something else happened. But 10 minutes passed and my father was nowhere to be seen. I stood up, left the camp a little and walked towards my father. When I still couldn't see him, I walked a little further. Finally, I heard footsteps from the front. I still couldn't see anything, but as the footsteps got closer, an incredible thought came to my mind. Before I knew they would look later, a voice from my left called my name. It was my father running towards me and yelling for me to come back. His voice was urgent and worried, so I ran towards the camp with my father behind me. He quickly put the necessary items into his bag. I still remember the look on my father's face. He was scared and worried. As we drove home, I asked him what he saw outside, who the man was and why he was screaming. My father didn't say anything. To this day, he has neither spoken nor said anything about what he saw. Every time I spoke that day, his expression completely changed and his face became dull, so I didn't ask. Now all I want is the footprints coming towards me and what would have happened if my father had not appeared in time. Story 2. Two of my college friends and I went camping in the woods near us for the weekend. I will use different names to protect their identities, so I will call them Ryan and Jamie. Ryan and I had no outdoor experience, so Jamie explained everything to us. He took us to a small place by the river. It was a few miles through the forest, but there was a large area by the river where we could camp. There was no one there when we got there. We set everything up in the middle of a field between the forest and the river, then took out our beers and sat around the camp. They looked like hunters, wearing dirty clothes and carrying backpacks, as if they had wandered into the forest, but I didn't see any weapons. But they are far away, maybe I can't see them. I showed these to my friends, but Jamie looked confused. He said hunting is illegal in these forests and he hasn't hunted yet. He looked like he was genuinely worried about them being here. Ryan joked that he was being very bad and we went back to our normal conversation. The sun has been setting for a while now and the journey has exhausted us. We all went to the tent, but I couldn't get used to it and had trouble sleeping. Sleeping outdoors in a small tent on a mattress made me very uncomfortable. I must have laid there for about 2 hours, during which time I thought I could at least get a few hours of sleep. But suddenly something woke me up, footsteps approaching our tent. When they heard these, they unzipped the tent and left. But after just a few minutes I realized there was something beyond the steps. There are 2 or 3 people, maybe more, along the entire row. I looked at the thin wall of the tent, thinking I should see its lights coming towards us, but there was no light. Yes, everyone present had to see our tent set up in the middle of an open field, and no one in their right mind would pass us like that. I pretended to be asleep and quietly listened to their approach. The line was just a few feet away from us, passing in front of our tent. When they were far enough away, I quietly unzipped the tent and looked out. While I was doing this, Ryan unzipped the tent. We all looked at each other with warning looks on our faces, then looked out at the crowd. They don't show much, but they still move away. I slipped out of the tent, opened Jamie's tent, and woke him up. We both explained what had happened and were surprised that he seemed more scared than either of us, probably because he had been camping many times and knew how different the situation was. I feel very uncomfortable spending the night. As we were packing up our belongings, Jamie suddenly asked us to hurry up in a trembling voice. We looked at him and followed his gaze. A group of 5 or 6 people were standing in the forest, watching us. My adrenaline was pumping. I packed everything in my bag and we all set off. We turned off the lights so we wouldn't see anything else on the road, hoping not to be seen. Luckily, we came back, but it is unknown what the group was doing there. But all things considered, I don't think it's a coincidence that we ran into them. Story 3. I went camping at a familiar spot in the woods near my town. To be honest, my town is small and not crowded, so camping is one of the things I like to do. But I don't like walking. I like the more relaxed atmosphere of camping, like sitting by the fire and not taking on any responsibilities. The path I follow is one I have traveled many times. Parking is just over 30 minutes walk away and the campsite is right next to the lake. But this time, when I arrived, a man had set up his tent. I saw him walking on the beach. He looks like he's in his 40s. He was wearing a pair of swimming shorts and a dirty white shirt. I moved a little further away from his tent and set up my own. Then I gathered large rocks from nearby and put them in a ring for the campfire I would make later. But this is more than just a moment. He was standing by the lake, his body turned towards me, looking at me. I tried to ignore him, but every time I looked back he was in the same place, still looking at me. It was hard, so I waved at him to see if he wanted to say hello. But after I waved back, he turned around and continued walking along the lake. But I didn't like it. It made me feel uncomfortable around the guy, so I tried to follow him for a while. His cabin in the woods. I thought maybe there was a path to follow, or maybe he was just wandering around. But either way, I was glad he was gone. I put a chair by the lake to rest. I stayed there for about an hour before carrying the chairs back to the tent. The sun was setting and I lit the campfire. While looking around the forest, I suddenly saw something in the distance. There is a picture next to the trees. I squinted my eyes to see better. All I could see was what looked like a white shirt. Again, that man was standing far behind my camp, looking at me. How long did he look at me? To avoid seeing him, I moved my chair to the other side of the camp so I could face him. He stayed there for 30 or 40 minutes, watching me from a distance in the forest before it got dark. There were shadows everywhere, making it hard to see him clearly. After a while, I could barely see him. I could only see the general direction of where he was, but when the fire lit up my vision, I knew he could still see me. Everything and I was starting to get really nervous. I mean, what is this guy doing? He has a tent here, like he's camping, but I haven't seen him leave in the few hours I've been here. As everything went through my mind, I considered packing up and leaving, but this time I was worried the guy would follow me. So I sat by the fire, made sure it wouldn't go out, and then I waited. He never returned to his tent or came close enough for me to see him. When the sun rose, I looked around and saw no sign of him. I gathered my belongings and put them in my car. It is difficult to know that person's intentions. If I hadn't been awake and careful from the beginning, who knows where I would be right now.